All right, the Renaissance. So we're going to start by looking at this slideshow on the Renaissance. The first thing, the Renaissance was a time of rebirth between the 1300s and 1600s. And in the background, you can see a picture of Italy. And that is where the Renaissance began between the 1300s and the 1600s. Now, even though I'm showing you a picture of Italy, there wasn't a country of Italy during this time. All right, we have the idea of different city-states that lived or that flourished during this time period in the country that we now call Italy. But again, the Renaissance began during the 1300s and through the 1600s. Let's go to the next slide. We have a map of all of Europe, and we can see that here is Europe. It's very similar to the map that we just did for our assignment. And you can see we've got England up in the top left. You got France and Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Alps mountains, and then down into the Papal States. And then more than just the map we had on our homework assignment, we can see the rest of Eastern Europe. We've got Hungary, Bulgaria. We've got the Ottoman Empire as well, where Constantinople was or is. And then we have the southeastern Mediterranean Sea, where we've got northern Africa. And we can see once Constantinople fell to the Ottomans and was no longer Christian, the Europeans needed to increase their trade. They needed to find another place, and it revert back to the Roman Empire in the Papal States. And we're going to see that the Papal States became a central focal point for trade with Eastern Europe, with the Middle East and Asia and North Africa. And so all the trade came through the Papal States here, and whether it was Venice, Florence, a couple other cities, and then into the rest of Europe, especially Western Europe. So it was a very focal point for trade, and that again led to the Renaissance. The next one, beginning of the Renaissance. The Renaissance began in a wealthy northern Italian trade cities like Venice and Florence, where contact with the Byzantine and Muslim empires flourished. And the idea of cultural diffusion took place here. Right? Cultural diffusion is the spread of different ideas through interactions with one another, whether it is the spread of actual thinking ideas, right, of how to do stuff, philosophies, psychologies, and thought. It's the spread of physical ideas such as buildings, or like building projects or different ways of construction. It also includes the spread of trade, right? Different items that are traded, whether they're spices or foods, clothing, and much, much more. And so again, cultural diffusion is the spread of ideas, and that is what helped promote the Renaissance, especially in Venice and Florence. Let's go to the next slide, Renaissance, right? And Renaissance means rebirth. And specifically, it was the rebirth of art and learning. The rebirth of art and learning during this time began to flourish. And so being educated, learning about the past, really promoted the Renaissance. And this happened because of economic growth, because of trade, and the growth growth of power, and the presence of a lot more money. It encouraged learning. And so we're going to see how that began in northern Italy and then began to spread throughout all of Europe. So again, hopefully we've answered those first couple questions. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We have economic foundations. So economic foundations. Now, the questions ask you to write down one of these economic foundations. There are 4 different bullet points. You can choose to write down one of those 4. The first one talks about increased demand for Middle Eastern products. Now, just like in any convenience store or store that you go to, if more and more people are buying that product, those stores are going to buy more and put it out on their shelves so that the consumer can buy it. During the early 1300s and through the 1600s, people demanded for more products from the Middle East, specifically different spices and clothing, and then different ideas as well. And because of this, there was a demand. And this encouraged merchants to go to the Middle East, buy these items, and bring them back to Italy and the city-states within northern Italy and then sell them there. And they weren't just selling them at cost, right? If a merchant went to the Middle East, he might buy some silk clothing. Say he buys it for $10. And then when he returns back to Italy, he's going to sell it for $15 to $20. He's going to mark it up so that he can make a profit. And because of these profits, Italian merchants were able to grow in wealth and money, and therefore they were able to spend this extra money they had on luxurious items. Second bullet point says encourage the use of credit and banking. And then number 3 is letters of credit expanded supply of money and sped up trade. And so the idea of credit was introduced, right? And credit, even today, right? We might have credit cards, or adults might have credit cards. And essentially what that is you are paying something without using cash. You're using credit, which means that you will have to pay your credit card company back later. And a credit card company, or the banks at this time, they would give someone credit, and they'd say maybe they gave a person $100, and what that person had to do, though, was pay the bank back $102 or $105 at a later time because there was interest. And this was a way for banks to make money. They would loan out credit or money to someone else, but would charge them more at a later date. And that's what our credit cards do today. Right, I have a credit card. If I go and spend $100 on my credit card, different credit cards have different interest markups on it. And so I would have to, if I don't make my payment right away, then instead of owing $100 back to my credit card company, I might owe $102 or $105 or more. And specifically, I'll give you a real life thing. Right now I have a credit card, and I've spent $6,000 on my credit card. I've spent $6,000 on my credit card. If I don't pay it back on May 27th, because that's when I have to make my payments, or on the 27th of every month, if I don't make that payment on the 27th, then I get charged a 17% interest. All right, so I get charged 17% interest if I don't make the payment on time. That's a lot of extra money. If you do the math on a calculator, it's about $1,020 more in interest. So if I miss a payment, I'm going to have to owe a lot more money back to my credit card company. So don't worry, Mr. Greasby's going to make his payment on time. But that's how credit works, is if you don't make the payment back on time, then you get charged interest. And Italian bankers from these different city-states were able to flourish and make a ton of money because they would loan out some money to people. And if they couldn't make the payment back in time, they would have to owe interest and extra money. Now, because of this, it opened up new jobs like accounting and bookkeeping and other practices that also used Arabic numbers. And this number system, it's the same number system we use today, right, started in the Middle East and was brought from Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula to Italian city-states. And so the accountants began to use these number systems to record the data. And again, this practice also began to spread throughout Northern Europe. Let's go to the next slide. We've got Italy. Now, Italian city-states became rich from trade. Florence, Venice, and Genoa were the 3 more popular city-states during this time period that began to flourish because of trade. You have Venice up here in the Adriatic Sea. You've got Genoa and Florence on the west side of Italy. And these 3 cities became very popular and very important with trade, not just trade from the Middle East and from Northern Africa, but also trade into Northern Europe and into places like France, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and much more. And they were trading centers for distribution of goods to Northern Europe. These city-states were governed as republics by wealthy merchants. And so they had different people ruling them. There wasn't a king of all of Italy. These city-states functioned as individual cities. Just like if Westminster had its own ruler, right? Maybe we had a king of Westminster, but when we traveled into Garden Grove or Huntington Beach or Anaheim, there would be another ruler with different set of rules. These city-states were like that. They were independent little kingdoms or city-states that ruled themselves. They were governed by wealthy merchants. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We've got Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli was a famous writer. He wrote the book called The Prince, and it gave guidelines on how to get power for absolute rule. Now, Machiavelli might have a different way of thinking than we do today, but he believed that the ends justified the means, which meant that if what you want happens at the end, it doesn't matter how you get there, right? It doesn't matter if you've had to maybe be dishonest. If you get what you want at the end of it, that's okay. And so again, it's not a way of thinking that we kind of cultivate here in the United States, right? But it is a way of thinking that he thought. And again, that third bullet point up there, one should do good if possible, but evil when necessary. And so Machiavelli, right, and some of the ways of thinking during the Renaissance was trying to, promote yourself, your own interest. And we're going to see that that's something within the Renaissance that was very important, the way of humanism and the way of promoting oneself first instead of looking out for others or maybe the church as we see in the early Middle Ages. All right, so we've got the next one is art and literature. We see in medieval art and literature, it focused on the church and salvation. However, in Renaissance art and literature, it began to focus on individuals and worldly matters along with Christianity, right? So it wasn't just Christianity, but there's a breakout into looking at individual stuff and worldly matters. And so art and literature changed during the Renaissance. And a lot of people say that our Renaissance artists and writers were not Christian or were not following the faith, the Catholic faith, but they were. They did a lot. There was a lot of artwork that's still based around artist faith, but they also started to branch out and draw and paint and make sculptures of their own things, of worldly things that were happening within the world. So there wasn't such a narrow focus on the Catholic faith that we see in earlier medieval times, literature and art. We have different artists and writers. Now I'm going to share two different artists with you. I think one of the questions, it asks you to list one artist and one of the works he's done. I'm going to share with you about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So there's two different artists. You get to choose one of them and then tell me one thing that they did, one piece of artwork. And then we're also going to look at Petrarch, who is a famous writer during this time. So let's look at Leonardo da Vinci. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Those are his famous two. So if you're writing on Leonardo da Vinci, you can write down the Mona Lisa or Last Supper. But those are the two more popular paintings that he did. But he wasn't just a painter. He was a singer and he composed poetry and songs. He also was an artist and scientist and inventor. And something important about Leonardo da Vinci, early on, there's manuscripts and there's other historical accounts that he actually went to cemeteries and dug up dead bodies to analyze them. He was one of the first people to ever look at a human body and do an autopsy on it after they had died, because he wanted to study the muscles, the veins, and understand the human body, but underneath the skin. And before that, it was frowned upon, and people didn't do autopsies. They didn't look at a person after they had died. But Leonardo, he wanted to better understand the human body, and so he performed autopsies in the middle of the night to better understand, but he also applied this to his paintings and his sculptures. Right? If you look at the paintings, they're so much more realistic than other people during this time because he studied the human body. He also was an inventor and a scientist. He actually created the first flying machine. He had a blueprint for it. It kind of looked like a helicopter-ish today. He never built it because they didn't have the tools or the technologies, but he had an outline or a blueprint for the first flying machine. He also had a blueprint for the first tank. When we think of for armies, a tank, he had a blueprint for a very primitive tank. And so again, he used his scientific and inventing skills to not just paint and do artwork, but also create other scientific and realistic things that we use today. And here is a picture of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, his two most famous paintings. So the Mona Lisa and then the Last Supper are right here. The next slide shows Michelangelo. Now, Michelangelo, he is most famous for painting the Sistine Chapel and also doing the sculpture of David. And so Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel and sculpted David. And he was a sculptor, which means that he used a hammer and a chisel to carve out of rock or marble different statues. And so this is a very fine and precise job. It was very difficult because if you make a chip or a crack in the rock and it breaks off, you don't just glue it back together. You have to now mend and make it better from what you have left. And so sculpting was very tough, required a lot of patience. He also painted the top of the Sistine Chapel. And this was also very difficult. And he struggled, and it took him a long time to paint the entire ceiling because he would often get neck aches from looking straight up at the ceiling all the time. And so he actually had like ladders where he could lay down right below the ceiling and paint that way to help his neck, because he had often grown tired of looking up and painting the ceiling of the chapel. And Michelangelo was a sculptor, painter, architect, and poet. And here are his two pictures. The first one is the Sistine Chapel here, and this is just part of the entire chapel. This is a picture showing God touching the finger of Adam and bringing him to life, or that's what his meaning of this picture was. And so we can see the Sistine Chapel. Again, this is only one small little picture of the entire chapel that was painted with other scenes from the Bible. So this is the Sistine Chapel. And then we have the sculptures of David and Pieta. And so we've got these two sculptures that he made out of marble. And again, he would just use a little chisel and hammer to carve this out of the marble. And so we have David and Pieta. The next one, Petrarch. He was a sonnet writer, so he wrote different sonnets, poet, and poetry, and so he would write these different ideas on humanism. And so he began to write about humanism and the individualistic ideas of a person, and he is considered the father of humanism. If we go ahead and take a look at the next picture, we've got humanism, and here is what humanism kind of looks at. It celebrated the individual. It looked at a specific person rather than as a community, rather as the ideas of the church, but it celebrated a person being unique and individualistic. It stimulated the study, though, of Greek and Roman literature and culture. So humanism helped promote the study of history when it came to the Greek and the Romans. So people would look back 15 to 2,000 years before them and study the Greek and Roman culture to better understand them, but also to bring it back to life and to make it a part of their own life. Just like how we might look at cultures or times in the past and bring back similar